that ministered to my soul. And for those of you who were not here last night, I'm glad you're here today. And I heard that there was a wedding last night. Hope you had a great time of celebrating that. And I'm looking forward to this morning. I'm going to deviate just a bit from what I said last night because there are some new folks here. I'm going to review a bit and also massage the truth that we talked about last night a little bit deeper. And I understand that last night can be kind of theoretical, so we're going to flesh it out a little bit this morning. And then what I promised was the second session this morning, I'm going to make it to the third session. So we're just going to make sure I'm teaching people and not just topics here, so that we're massaging these truths into our souls. And as we start this morning, let me also mention something. I have the greatest wife ever, at least I think so, because about 5 years ago, my wife gave me the coolest Father's Day gift ever. Okay, so, Daniel mentioned last night my love for Star Wars, and I mentioned also that how that kind of set my foot on a trajectory to be an astronaut, and then God changed my plans. But about 5 years ago, my wife didn't get me a grill for Father's Day. She didn't give me any kind of thing like real practical. She gave me the best gift ever. Here it is. A stormtrooper suit from Star Wars. Okay, it's actually not on, you can't see it on there. So, but it's on my screen, it's not on there. That got frozen or stuck or something there. So, but a stormtrooper suit from Star Wars, and they're rebooting or something back there, so we'll see if it comes on. But, and the kids just love it. Not my kids, but I use that suit for vacation Bible school at Faith Church, and it was just a great time. The kids love it then. So, stormtrooper suit there. Okay, there it is. I'm the big guy, not the little guy there. So, okay, see if it moves a bit. Here we go. And we have something called Trunk or Treats around Halloween to minister to our community. And there was a group of kids there at our trunk or treat, and they were dressed up in Star Wars. And again, I'm the big one there, not the little one. So they love that. And also, my mom, I mentioned to you my mom last night. She went to be with the Lord about 2 years ago, but she was the first one who ever took me to see Star Wars back in 1977 when I was just a little kid. And she developed a habit of every Christmas sending me Hallmark ornaments. You know, those Hallmark ornaments that, and they're Star Wars ships, you can get those. And so she was doing that for like 25 years. And I ended up getting so many Star Wars ornaments. I didn't ask for them. I thought they were cool, but she kept sending them to me every Christmas. And eventually there were too many to put on one tree. So I ended up having to make my own Star Wars tree. So you can see down here, there's like R2-D2 and Star Wars ships and all that, and there's even a Death Star up at the top. So if you're not a Star Wars fan, don't worry about it. You don't probably understand anything what that means, but that's okay. And again, I want to thank you again for being here today, because I know it's a beautiful day today. You could be out enjoying the sun, but you're here studying the Word of God together, and I appreciate that heart and that spirit. And just remember, you'll have 364 other sunny days here in California, so you can enjoy those. That's not true in Indiana, so we will not have as much sun as you have. All right, here's what I want to kind of press into our souls this morning. I'm not here primarily to talk to you about getting your children to behave. I know that's our desire. If I could just get my kids to sleep at night, if I could just get my kids to act right, if I could just make my kids obey, I understand that's our desire as parents. But that's not my goal here with you today. The best thing you can do for your children is for you to model what God would have us to be in front of our children and point them to the one incomparable God who is like none other, because they're going to be chasing after all kinds of other so-called gods on this earth. And if we are fulfilling our purpose as parents, and it's not to get them to behave, if we are fulfilling our purpose as parents, we put ourselves in the best possible position to point them to the one true God. So that's what I want us to make sure that we get nothing else from this conference today, that we get that. So last night I started with the story of Samson. And the Samson was a man who his mom, because she was concerned about his future purpose as a deliverer of Israel that the angel told her, she did not tell Samson his purpose. She did not tell her husband Samson's purpose. And Samson grew up without knowing his purpose. And all of those special set of behaviors that God had wanted Samson to have, to mark him out as something different and special, Samson did not adopt any of those behaviors. In fact, the rest of the story of Samson showed you that he rejected all of those behaviors. And I would submit to you that it's because he ultimately did not grasp and understand his special designated purpose. So then I went to Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, and showed you in an illustrative fashion what our purpose is. And it's not just our purpose as a parent. I went to Genesis chapter 1, 26 to show you what our purpose is in life. And that doesn't change when it comes to parenting. So Genesis 1:26, we are made in the image and likeness of God. And I showed you in a visual way that means you are the visible representation of the invisible God. God made his image and likeness. So when people look at you, they're supposed to see God, because you are the visible representation of the invisible God. Now, the first commandment that God gave his people, Adam and Eve, was to be fruitful and multiply. Okay, so be fruitful and multiply. So God in creation said, I want all of these little visible representations of me. And if they're multiplying, then the whole earth would be filled with little visible representations of God, all representing his value system, his reign, so that the earth would be full of his glory. Okay? You know, Israel, we failed at that. Adam and Eve sinned. But God still never, ever jettisoned his purpose. In Genesis chapter 11, on the call of Abraham, I did not mention this last night, but God reached down to a pagan family, Abraham, and said, Abraham, if you will follow me to a land that I haven't shown you yet, I'm going to make your name great. And think about this for just a second in regard to the purpose. Last night, I converted this room into the ancient Near East. That was Turkey. That was Egypt. This was the land of Canaan. And God called Abraham right out of the area of Babylon and called him right here to the land of Canaan. And let me ask you a question here to think about first. Why did God call Abraham to this land, the land of Canaan? Why did God, if I was being called of God, God, call me to Hawaii or something. Man, that would be great. Why did God call Abraham to the land of Canaan? That's a curious choice. Anybody have a thought on why God called Abraham to that land and said, I'm going to give you this land? Why did God do that? Any thoughts on that? What would you say? Any speculation? Yes. The center of the known world. Yeah, if you wanted to go from Turkey down to Egypt, you had to go through this land. If you wanted to go from Babylon to Egypt, you had to go along the Fertile Crescent and then go through this land bridge. So God called Abraham right here to this land, center of the known world. Okay, before China was populated, before the Americas were populated, it was the center of the known world. And here's what God said to Abraham: if you follow me there, I'll make your name great, and you can be basically my representative, because he was going to make Israel into a great nation. And I want you to see what in Exodus chapter 19, verse 6, Exodus chapter 19, verse 6, God said to Israel, when Israel became a great nation and they were ready to go into the promised land, God said, you're going to be to me a kingdom of priests. Now, lock onto that term priest for just a second. What do priests do? Priest represents. So there's our purpose again. Priest represents God. So Israel in the center of the world, when the nations around them would look at Israel, they were supposed to see God. God dwelling in their midst, Israel representing God's value system. So the priests, a kingdom of priests, were to represent God. Okay? So there's our purpose once again. You are the visible representation of the invisible God. So to your children, your first purpose is not to get them to behave. Your first purpose is ultimately to represent God and his value system to your children. Israel ultimately failed at that goal. We know that because they were enamored with idols. And when the nations looked at Israel, they ultimately saw not God, they saw all of the common idols of the nations. But God still had a plan. He was still going to have a people for his very own name that represented him. And this time he was going to send his very own son. And I mentioned to you last night Colossians 1:15. So Colossians chapter 1:15, God sent his very own son. And that son would do this. He was described as the image of the invisible God. So Jesus is the perfect visible representation, fulfilling God's plan, the perfect visible representation of the invisible God. So I want to know what God looks like, how do I see him now? I see him in Jesus. And guess what Jesus is doing? Let me show you a verse here. Okay? And what is Jesus doing now in us? Romans 8:28 and 29. Romans chapter 8, verse 28 and 29. And we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. There's our purpose statement right there, or at least the word purpose. And we're going to find out what that purpose is. For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to become conformed, there it is, to the image of his Son, so that he, Christ, would be the firstborn among many, many brethren. So God's plan has not changed. Let me explain that. In the beginning, God made the purpose of mankind to be the visible representation of the invisible God, and he gave Adam and Eve the command to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, so that the earth would be filled with God's glory, his representation. We failed at that, but God was not done with his plan. He sent Jesus Christ as the perfect visible representation of the invisible God. And now, not through physical procreation primarily, but through spiritual procreation, rebirth, you must be born again. We have the perfect visible representation of Jesus Christ, who is producing in all of us that are his children the image of his Son. And if I am in the image of his Son, I am in the image of God, because he's that perfect visible representation of God. Therefore, I'm fulfilling my created purpose in the beginning. Okay? So, your purpose, you are the visible representation of the invisible God. Let me show you one more verse, and then I'm going to have my wife come up here and talk a little bit about fleshing this out some. So in 1 Peter chapter 2, I want you to see it now in verse 9. You are a chosen race, a royal priesthood. That's exactly a quote there from Exodus chapter 19. A priesthood, a holy nation. There's your purpose. So that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who has called you out of darkness into his marvelous lights. There's your purpose, to represent God in front of others, his value system. So your purpose comes first. And now notice your behavior, verse 11. Beloved, I urge you as aliens and strangers to abstain from fleshly lusts which wage war against your soul. Keep your behavior excellent. So here's what we've seen. Your purpose precedes your behavior. Your purpose, knowing and grasping your purpose, precedes your behavior. And all of us are struggling with our children's behavior. If they would just behave. Well, I wonder if our children understand their purpose. What I did last night with you right here in converting this room into the ancient Near East and having the great king come and stand up statues and all of that, when my children were small, in order to try to convey this concept to them, to teach them their purpose, okay? So to teach them their purpose, I converted the living room into the ancient Near East with blocks and all that, and put the boundaries up. And then I had my kids stand as the great king or a statue. And one of you, I think it was one of you, maybe Albert or somebody, came to me and said, Brent, that was a very helpful image last night. I'll never forget that. And our children have never forgot that either. So this is not hard to do, to teach them, to convert your living room into the ancient Near East and do something like that, to begin to have your children grasp their purpose. Okay? The only other purpose that they will have or you will have is captured in Genesis 11 at the Tower of Babel, when the people said, and we talked about this last night, that let us gather together and make a name for ourselves. As opposed to representing God, let's gather together and make a name for ourselves. And God gave them a name of confusion. Babel, that's what that means. So there are really only two purposes in this life. Either I will represent God in his value system, or the only other purpose that you will have in some way or shape will represent yourself. So let us make a name for ourselves, and that will result in confusion. Always, always, always. Okay? So, going back to our notes here, here's the bottom line from that first session. A parent must be fulfilling. And when I say must, it's sobering, and this is where we cry out to God for help. A parent must be fulfilling his or her created redemptive purpose. If you're not fulfilling your purpose, how is your child going to see and understand their purpose? Okay? That's what I want to press you on. Okay? If you're not fulfilling your purpose, how will your child grasp? How will your child see what the purpose is in life? And that's where we start. A parent must be fulfilling his or her created or redemptive purpose of representing God, which includes knowing God more and living out his good way of life. So when my children see me, they see God in his value system. All right. With that in mind, I'm going to ask my wife to come up now and share a bit about one of our parenting fails, which we've had numerous ones, but our parenting fails so that you can see, well, here was an incident where Janet and I were not living out our purpose. Okay, go ahead, Janet.
Yeah, Brent mentioned that it's easy to teach, and you may or may not agree with that, but it's not a hard concept when you think about it, but it's really hard to model.
Yeah.
And if you know anything, if you're a parent, you know that your kids smell hypocrisy a mile away, right? When you tell them one thing but you're not living it, oh, yes, they know. So I'm going to share with you, because sometimes it can be helpful to what would that actually look like. Well, how about if I start with, here's what it would not look like. An example, at least from my life. So I know that my purpose is to represent God's values to my children, which is going to include being patient, being kind, certainly correcting, but doing that out of a desire for their soul, not my convenience. And one of my desires, which I don't believe was a bad desire, my husband worked 5 minutes from our house, half a mile. And my kids were probably 2 and 3 at the time. They were close in age. And we would play out in the driveway. So I had this picture in my mind. I don't think it was a bad picture. I wanted him to come around the corner. And one of the ways we were going to love him is he was going to see how excited we all were that he came home. And I had another mom tell me about, when her husband would walk in, the kids would run, we're so glad you're home. So I have no idea what his day's been like. I would love for Brent to come home and know we're all excited to see him, not guess what all went wrong today. But how about just, yay, we're glad you're home. So I think it's a great desire. I don't think it was bad. It was actually a way to teach my children to think of others and love their dad, and a way to show love to Brent. All of that's fine. So in my mind, I think this is a good thing. So we're out in the driveway playing, and my son has this little big wheel. He's 3, and he asked if he could go down the sidewalk. And he's allowed to go down 3 houses to a good friend of ours, her driveway, turn around the driveway, and come back. That's kind of what he's allowed to do. And so I'm looking at my watch thinking, I don't know. I didn't have like Life 360 where I knew exactly where Brent was every moment of the day. So I don't know exactly when he's going to come around the corner. But I'm like, I think you have to, yeah, that'll be fine. He said, yeah, go ahead and do that. But you have to know my son. My son, the best way I can describe him in this area is he enjoys the journey. He's never in a hurry. I and my daughter is a mini-me. We're just the opposite. So if I tell my daughter and son, we're leaving in about 5 minutes, she has run, put her shoes on, has her backpack waiting by the door, and if there's time, pull out a book while she waits. My son says, we got 5 minutes. And then as we're walking out the door, he says, oh, wait, where are my shoes? And then I think I have to go to the bathroom. This is my son, because he's enjoying wherever he's doing at the moment. So I know this about him, and he has helped me appreciate enjoying the journey, because I don't typically. So I need him in my life. He is slowly going in his big wheel, enjoying, I'm sure, everything he sees along the way. And he's at the farthest part. He's just about to turn around in the driveway to come back, and I look up and I see Brent's car coming around the corner. So I yell down to him, hey, buddy, come on back. Now, if I'd said that to Karis, she'd have been back before I'd finished saying it, because she's in a hurry. Not Josh. He slowly looks at me, looks back. He's not disobeying. This is his speed. And then keeps going because he has to go a little farther to make the turn. I'm thinking, get up, turn it around, get down, move. Like, you don't have to do the routine, but he does the routine, because that's what my son does. So he's not doing anything wrong, but he's slowly starting to turn around in the driveway. And I'm watching Brent come. Now, if my purpose is to represent God's values to my children, there's one way that I would respond to that. Here's how I know that that was not my purpose. That is not how I responded. I am now yelling, turn around. We need to be here to welcome your father. That's nice. We're going to show him that we love him. Get back here. And now I'm running toward him, because I can run down there, turn him around, and get him back before he's going to get back. So I run down there, and I say, get up, and I turn it around and put it down. He sits down and looks at me, and I see this broken-hearted face, because he had done nothing wrong. Even if he had, I shouldn't respond that way, but I don't even have that excuse. He had done nothing wrong. But I had a plan, And the plan was not, how do I represent God? It was, how do I get what I want, the way I want, and do what I think? How do I represent me right now? And he was not playing. So I stopped when I saw his face. Brent's pulling into the driveway. I'm down at the other end. Karis greeted him. I don't know what she did, but she was still standing there. So none of my plan has happened. We did not have an Instagram moment. But I looked at my son and I said, honey, I was wrong. Mommy was wrong. Now at 3, for me to say I sinned, I don't know that he understood all those words, but he knew right and wrong because we told him he's wrong a lot. So he knew that. So I said, Mommy was wrong. Will you forgive me? I should not talk to you that way. I was wrong. You were not wrong. Mommy was wrong. And so he wheels back down. So what's the first thing that Brent hears instead of, yay, we all love you? Josh runs in the door and says, Mommy wronged me. Mommy wronged me. And he looks at me and I'm like, I did. He's exactly right. And welcome home. So hope you feel loved right now, Brent. So on a very practical level, what does it look like to live for myself and not for God? I want my way, and I'm willing to sin. And I'm willing to sin when it doesn't happen. I'm willing to sin to try to make it happen. When what I needed to see is something far more important than all of us being in the driveway was representing the values of God and being patient while he came back. And Karis and I can welcome him, and we can all cheer Josh on as he comes back. Like that would have been no big deal, but it wasn't my plan. And so I was angry and sinned against my child because I was living for something different than the values of God in that moment. But until that moment, I didn't know it. I thought it was a really good plan. But it obviously became more important than showing the values of God. So just on a practical level, what does my anger show? You know, in page 22 of your notes is in the middle of a section where we're talking about questions we get asked a lot. And instead of hoping that we had time to address all of them, we compiled a lot of the questions that we typically get, and we wrote down the concept and then wrote down a lot of the principles to help you think through an answer to those. And the one I'm looking at right now says parents' anger, sinful parenting. Well, that's what I just told you. That's what I just did. So if my goal is to faithfully image God, then I'm going to have an environment that is only angry at what makes God angry, not angry at what upsets my plan. So I'm not going to be able to help. Frequently, when we help parents, they want help with their angry child. Yeah. And there are angry children. But the first thing that we have to think through is, you can't help your children with their anger if you're angry. So do you understand your own angry heart? And I would never have told you I was an angry person. I am not a screamer. Well, I was that day, right? But I'm not typically. But that certainly exposed anger when I don't get my way. So if I don't know how to deal with and repent of my own, I'll never know how to help my son, and I'll never have credibility. But I believe in our home, what we've tried to do is ask forgiveness a lot and work at changing. And if they saw that, then that is a far better backdrop. If my children are seeing me take my sin seriously, and they're seeing me working at growing and changing, because I'll never be the perfect representation of Christ to my kids. I won't be. So we can either just quit and say, that's my job and I can't do it, or we can say, but what I can show you is, what does someone who loves Jesus look like when they realize they have sinned? Because they need to learn how to do that too. So they need to see me owning it and then working at change. And if I'm modeling that, then I've modeled for them what they should do when they're angry and they see they need to change. They'll know what to do. So what is that going to mean? Working on my own growth personally, and I'm not going to be able to work on my own anger if I don't understand what's behind my anger. What is it I wanted so desperately that I was willing to sin and be angry with my son for it? I wanted a moment where it was the perfect picture of what I want, and that seems okay. But for me, big ones for me, I want efficiency. And so God gave me my son. Because that's not his priority. But I will tell you, I love red-winged blackbirds now because my son saw them everywhere. I've never seen a bird in my life. I don't notice it on the road. I'm getting somewhere. And we're doing what we're going to do, and we got to get somewhere. And Josh would go, every time we pass this point, there's a bunch of those. I love those birds with the red on their wing. And I'm like, what birds? I haven't even seen a bird.
And now my wife has a bird feeder outside of our backyard because of my son that we watch every morning for breakfast.
We do, and I take pictures of the red-winged blackbird, and I text them to him. And I've named him, and I'll tell, RW was back today, and so we talk about it.
RW for red wing.
Oh, we're not very creative, but that's what I did. I'm not a creative person either, and he is that too. So I have to learn. Efficiency is not the ultimate goal. Representing the values of Jesus is. And that if that's efficient at the moment, great. If it's not, great. Ease. So for me, I don't want to have to repeat myself. That's one of my goals. Are you kidding me? I've already told you to get your shoes on. Is there a reason I would have to say that again? You know how to do that. So is it wrong that I want my children to obey because that honors the Lord? No. But what happens when I need to repeat myself? How do I do it? How often does God have to repeat himself to me? Like, Janet, efficiency is not more important than loving them. And God is patient with me. So am I going to be patient with them? I don't want to go through the discipline process again right now. Can't you just put your shoes on so we can leave the house? Efficiency, ease. When those are my goals, I'm going to be angry. So if I don't understand those goals, I won't know how to repent at that level. I just have a right to a little me time, whatever that means. And can I tell you, you don't really mean that. What you mean is a lifetime of me time. Because when you get 5 minutes, it's never enough. How many of you have ever said, oh, I got my 5 minutes, I'm good now? No, we say, could I just have 5 minutes to myself, and then you get it, and you totally didn't help. So when that's my goal, I want to be obeyed. I want to be respected. I have all these things that I want that are not. I want to reflect the values of God.
And when she's doing that, and I'm doing that, last night I mentioned my struggle with sleep and our children not sleeping. And when I come out and say, will you just stop crying? And that's not helpful to our children. So that's all under the category of making a name for myself. Let me make a name for myself because I'm all about ease or comfort or convenience. And that always, when you live that way, God will give you a name. And that will be confusion because you've confused your purpose. Okay?
And I certainly confused my son that night.
And we confuse our son. So and that's where forgiveness and humility comes in. When I sin and fail to represent God, parents, and I know this is hard, but you don't. But the power of you humbly saying, I was wrong to your children, is that's which heals and shows them how to handle sin. So we, with God's help, try to confess to our children frequently when we recognize that we were wrong. And I understand that's hard. But that will be the way to begin to point them to the ultimate, perfect, visible representation. I'm not him. Now, you're the first representation of God that they see, but then you say, when you fail, I was wrong, and let me show you the perfect one, and that's Jesus.
Yep.
And that's where you have those gospel moments pointing to the perfect one, which is not you. Okay? All right, let me jump over. I'm going to have Janet back in just a moment. As I've thought through this, I wanted to jump to a session 3. So turn, if you will, to page number 8. Okay. Here's a question for us. If you represent God, if you're going to represent him well, if you're going to represent him well, what must you do? Let's think through that you're an ambassador for the United States. And you're overseas, and you're an ambassador for the United States. How will you represent the United States well to those in the country where you are? The answer is this. You must know what the United States values are, what their interests are. You must know what they are. So if I am going to represent God to my children, my community, or whatever, here is the only way that you can do that. You must know what God values. Okay? So I'm going to show you something in Exodus 19, verse 6. I've already mentioned this. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests, Exodus 19:6, and a holy nation. There's your purpose. Okay? The New Testament repeats that for churches, individuals, and churches. By the way, when the community of Elk Grove sees Laguna Chinese Baptist Church, they're supposed to see representatives of Christ right here. So when they look at this church, they're supposed to see God's value system. So if Laguna Chinese Baptist Church was somehow just raptured or taken away, would the community know that you're gone? Because you've so represented God here in this community. So, our purpose, kingdom of priests representing God. Then, once God gave our purpose, does anybody know what's in Exodus 20? So this was Exodus 19. What's Exodus 20? Does anybody know what Exodus 20 is? What is the content of Exodus 20? Okay, well, let me just show you. Exodus chapter 20. Exodus 20. The Ten Commandments, there they are. If you're going to know God, if you're going to represent Him, you got to know what He values. There is His value system right there. And the first one is, have no other gods before me. So if this is like a marriage, Israel, you're going to have one husband, and that's me. And then know what the husband values there. So God goes through a list of His value system so that Israel, His bride, would know what He values. So, parents, to fulfill your purpose, you have to know what God values. Now, I'm going to just go over this quickly. So let me show you this diagram here. I drew this young man sitting down, kneeling, with a little crown on his head, and he's underneath the great king. Okay, so there's a great king, God, and we're not him. And this young man is his representative. So what does God value in life? Now, the first thing is our center is God. So our center is God Himself. Have no other husband, spouse, other than me, God says. Right? And working its way out from there, God gives a command if you're married, and He says, the two shall become one flesh. So in Genesis chapter 2, verse 24, the two shall become one flesh. There is no other relationship on the face of this earth that is described as a one flesh relationship. Okay, so it's not parent-child. So children are to grow up and leave the parents. So the only one flesh relationship on the face of this earth is the spouse. So what does God value? Well, He values your relationship with God Himself, and then after that, He values your relationship with your spouse because He describes it in a different way than any other relationship on the face of this earth. And then if you have children, God gives you those children for 18 years, 19, 20, 30 years in your home. for those children, you have that unique opportunity to represent God for those 18 years or so and onward, but they're in your home 24/7. Okay? So you have that unique opportunity with children. And then the family of God. And in Galatians chapter 6, verse 9 and 10, it says, "Let us do good to all men, but especially to those who are of the household of faith." So relationships among the church. There's your next hierarchy of priorities. And then you have a relationship to the community of unbelieving folks out there. So this is our priorities. And if we ultimately, well, let me kind of summarize all of this for you. All of this is about relationships. Okay? Relationships. It's not about entertainment. It's ultimately not about work, although work is an important part of life. It's all about relationships, your relationship with God first, starting with your relationship with your spouse next, and then your children, and then the family of God, and then the community in which you reside. There's God's value system. If I want to represent God well, that's my purpose, then I have to know what he values. And the thing that he values the most is relationships. And you can summarize all of this in terms of love God. What is the greatest commandment? What is the greatest commandment? Love God. Second. What is the second? Okay, let me talk a little bit to me, okay? So I know you're still breathing underneath those masks, okay? So first one is love God. Second is love my neighbor. My closest neighbor is my spouse. My next closest neighbor is my children. And then the family of God, and then the unbelieving community. Life is about relationships. Okay, now, questions? So if we do that in a world of recession, disease, conflict, political turmoil, death, in a world of chaos, as we live out our purpose, knowing what God values, relationships, and the priorities there, we bring a little bit more of order and harmony in a world of chaos. In contrast, okay, let me show you this diagram. I pictured this individual as representing me, make a name for myself. So if my goal in life is to make a name for myself, and my children are going to make a name for me because they're going to be successful, they're going to be the most educated, they're going to be the easiest to deal with. So really that all comes back to me and my convenience. So let us make a name for ourselves. So, yes, he agrees with me on that. I am in the center. I live for fun and entertainment, live for money, live for pleasure, live for power. And in a world of recession, disease, conflict, political turmoil, death, that's the way that the world is living. And what that brings is more chaos, more confusion. When I make a name for myself, God will give you a name, that of confusion. Okay? So there's two options here. So with this in mind, let me ask you a few questions here. So with this in mind, where my priorities are correct, and I'm representing God under the great King, and I'm living out my goal of relationships, and I'm putting my relationship with God first, my relationship with my spouse next, my relationship with my children, then my church, and then on that platform, unbelievers. Based upon that model right there. Here's a question. So based upon God's values, what does your child need to see the most? Based upon God's value system right there, what does your child need to see the most? What does your child need to see the most in you? What does your child need to see the most in you? Because we want our children to experience all kinds of things. Star Wars. We want our children to experience all kinds of things. Football, soccer, the best musician, okay, the greatest career. None of that's mentioned there. What do our children need to see the most in us? How would you answer that? How would you answer that? What? Love. I appreciate that. Okay, if it's about relationships. And let's start with the first one. Love of what? So the thing that your children need to see the most in you, okay, is not you giving them the best education. And that could be a manifestation of love. But they need to see you loving God more than, frankly, loving them. They need to see you loving God more than you love your work. They need to see you loving God more than you love sleep, Brent, which I wasn't doing that night. Well, I wasn't sleeping and I wasn't loving God. They need to see you loving God more than loving the perfect family environment that my wife was trying to create for me. Okay? So what your children need to see the most in you is that relationship with God. Secondly, based upon that model, what do they need to see the most? After that, what do they need to see the most based upon that after your relationship with God? Spouse. Okay, your spouse. Your relationship with your spouse. Now turn, if you will, to, let's see what page it's on. I'm going to show you something here. Page 33. Okay, page 33. This is an excerpt from a good resource of The Heart by Lou Priola. The chapter, the excerpt I've given you, I mean, if this just gives you an indication of how good the book is. So I've given you this chapter so that you would possibly buy the book, and I don't know if you guys have it here, but you'd buy the book and then you'd benefit from it. So this is a teaser. But what Lou Priola does here is give you like 25 ways that you're provoking your children to anger. Right? That you parents, and notice the first one. The first one is a lack of marital harmony. So what your children need to see the most is not, I've got to get them to violin practice on Tuesday. I've got to get them to piano practice on Wednesday. And I got to get them to soccer on Thursday. And that'll drive us crazy. And they're good experiences. But if all those are at the expense of, number one, your relationship with God, and number two, your relationship with your spouse, okay, we're not representing God in his value system there. So I would encourage you, sometime maybe this weekend as you're thinking about these things, to go over this chapter of ways that we're struggling in our priorities. And the first one is a lack of marital harmony. One of the first in counseling, so I've been counseling for, I don't know, all of my pastoral career. So when I first started being a pastor, the first year I got trained in counseling. So I started early in counseling. And parents come to me when their children are 16 years old and their children are like out of control. And they say, fix my child. And as I began to dig into the story, what I understand is that there's marital disharmony. And so one of my first things to talk to parents about is how are you doing in your marriage first? And eventually, parenting counseling becomes marriage counseling, okay? And that begins to talk about the relationship with God and where is God and all this. So it becomes, how is your relationship with God type counseling? So parents, my encouragement to you is that if you're struggling in your marriage or your relationship with God, before we talk about our children and parenting, get some help there. So I know Pastor Daniel and the church here counsels. I would encourage you to work on that relationship with God first and the relationship with your spouse next. You begin to get those things in place, and then you can bring a little bit more harmony to your home there. Janet, would you share on the priority one here as well?
Failed is what you're saying? You want to hear what else I did wrong?
Yes, I do.
Makes him feel better. So when we were thinking about priorities, so again, if my priority, love God, love my husband, love my children, one of the things that we do, you've heard of maybe the counseling conference that we have every February back in Lafayette. That's an incredibly busy week for our whole church. One of my favorite weeks of the year. I love it. But it's very, very busy. My kids, back in the day, I don't know if you're still doing it this many times, but Brent would speak over 20 times that week. So that would mean they're not going to see their dad. And I don't want them to get bitter about the fact that their dad's not around. So, and just the energy. I love being at the conference. So when I had my little kids, we were there passing out handouts in the morning. We did morning break, lunch, afternoon break, and then we went home. We were there all day serving. It was so good for my kids. It was a great experience. But we get tired. And so are the guests. So I would always tell my kids, by Thursday afternoon is the very last time that we do anything, and then we're done. So Thursday, the guests are coming in, they're getting their hand out, they're looking a lot more tired. When we're serving coffee at the breaks, they're asking for double caffeine. Because the first part of the week, it's, can I have half calf? Can I have some with decaf? By the end of the week, nobody wants anything decaf. And they're begging for more coffee, and my kids were always serving coffee, so they saw that. And I'm always telling the kids, they're getting tired. They need you to smile. They need you to be an encouragement to them. So now we're on the last break, afternoon break on Thursday afternoon. Everybody's tired. My daughter is wiping up tables from lunch to get ready for the break, for the people to come in, and she's dragging. And then she's starting to complain a little. Yeah. I'm so tired. I don't want to do this. And she has a very transparent face. So it's like, who would want her to serve them anything? You know? And so I'm telling her, honey, I know you're tired. The guests are tired. We got to love people. This is when we ask God for help. We just need to love people. So I tell her that. She's still dragging. And at some point, again, because my priority somewhere moved from I'm doing this for the glory of God to you're wearing a name tag that says Aucoin, and they all know who your dad is. And we're not going to be that family that is whiny and complaining when the guests come in. So you will be smiling. You will be happy. And when they come in here, honey, you need to stop whining. Stop complaining. Everybody's tired, and nobody wants to hear it. Just smile. So I am now scolding my daughter, because doesn't that model a happy heart? So my young daughter, who is tired, I am scolding her, and I am telling her how she will be happy, because I'm representing Brent. Well, I'm really representing Jesus in how I talk to my daughter. She's a higher priority than the family of God that was about to walk in that door. But not in my mind. They were then a higher priority than her. So I was going to use her so that we looked good to other people. So I did that. We get through the break. We get home. She lays down. She has 102 fever. Parenting failed. My daughter is sick. At any point in there, did I ask how she was actually feeling? Did I feel her forehead? Did I try to help her? No, because my priority was not, daughter, are you okay? It was, daughter, we need to look good. So my priorities were totally out of whack. And now, can we just add, how bad could that be? Well, how about if the next year we do all this again, there's Thursday afternoon, my daughter is complaining, and I do the very same thing and scold her, and we get home, and she has a fever again. And I'm like, thank you, Lord, for just... So I didn't do it a third time. Can we just say I'm slow? But I began to learn. But the priority of looking good and even wanting to love your guests could never be at the expense of loving my child. And at that moment it was. And yes, I did ask forgiveness. She is very gracious to forgive, and we have a good relationship now. But just
good thing we have a
example of
counseling ministry at Faith Church, because our children need therapy. So
we did tell them that all growing up. When you're an adult and we have really messed up more than we know people who can help you. So, because you're going to need it. But just an example of it looks like a right priority. But if I'm willing to be unkind to my daughter, even if she was just complaining and didn't have a fever, it was wrong. But I didn't even take the time to find out what was really going on with her. And she was sick.
And so on page 34, you'll look at number 5, scolding, another way to provoke your children to anger. And so the root of that is we weren't modeling the right purpose, not the right priorities. We wanted something else, making a name for ourselves rather than God, bringing confusion, and that resulted in our behavior of scolding there. So you can see number 5 right there. Now, thank you, Janet. Here's what we're going to do. Now I'm going to give them 15 minutes here in just a moment, and we'll go into lunch of about 15 minutes, since I got this a little bit 15 minutes later. So you're going to get your break in just a moment. But let me review what we've covered so far. Number 1, your purpose. Your purpose, you are the visible representation of the invisible God. Just why don't you say that with me? And I am the visible representation. So let's say that together. I am the visible representation of the invisible God. Okay? The only other purpose that I can ultimately choose, it'll be summarized in something like this. I'll be making a name for myself, the Tower of Babel. And when I do that, if I make a name for myself, it always results in confusion, because I have confused my purpose. Now let me give you a little bit of hope here, okay? And then I'm going to let us go to our break. There was one man on the face of this earth who walked this earth who never made a name for himself. He never made a name for himself. And Jesus Christ. Okay, so in the classic passage of Isaiah 53, he made himself of no accord. He was despised and forsaken. So the opposites of what we do, make a name for ourselves, and we want our children to make us look good also, to make a name for ourselves, so they won't embarrass us. God came down in human flesh and represented God perfectly, and he did not make a name for himself. Throughout his entire life, no name. And up to the point where they crucified him on the cross. And why did he do that for us? Because we were the ones who made a name for ourselves. Jesus came down and did not make a name for himself, and ultimately was put to death on the cross. But I want you to see the hope. The one who did not make a name for himself, God gave him the ultimate name above every name. Philippians chapter 2. So God promises you, as you strive to humble ourselves and not make a name for ourselves, but make a name for God, that one day, somehow, some way, as he did with Jesus, he's going to take care of the name that we all desired. He will make a name for you, and the eyes have not seen, nor ears heard what he has in store for those who love him and fulfilling your purpose. Okay? All right, so let's